RELIVE 1966, a workday in the city. Crowded bus, typewriter in the office, quick lunch at the counter, and the ride back home in the late afternoon. The West Clock's alarm clock shattered the November silence at exactly 6:15 a.m., its metallic voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of the O'Connor household on Ashland Avenue. Michael Patrick O'Connor's hand found the off switch with the practiced precision of 8 years of marriage and 12 years of steady employment. The sound died, but the weight of another day pressed down on his shoulders before his feet even touched the cold hardwood floor. Outside, Chicago was still wrapped in that peculiar autumn hush that comes just before the city awakens. Street lamps cast amber pools on sidewalks dusted with the season's first real cold, and the distant rumble of the elevated train carried the promise of another Monday in November 1966. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, running his fingers through hair that Margaret insisted was still thick enough to be respectable, though the mirror told him otherwise each morning. "Coffee's on," came Margaret's voice from the kitchen, soft and warm as the flannel nightgown she wore. After 8 years, she still woke before the alarm, still had his coffee percolating by the time his feet hit the floor. It was one of those small miracles of married life that Michael had learned to cherish rather than take for granted. The kitchen glowed yellow under the overhead light, a warm sanctuary against the November morning. Margaret stood at the counter in her powder blue robe, her auburn hair pinned back in the careful way that made her look like the college girl he'd fallen in love with at St. Mary's Parish Dance in 1957. The Folgers was already filling his favorite mug, the one with World's Greatest Dad that Tommy had given him last Father's Day, and the smell mixed with the bacon grease in the cast-iron skillet. "Sleep well?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Michael had been tossing and turning for 3 weeks now, ever since the Morrison & Associates audit had begun revealing its secrets. Well enough. He accepted the mug and the gentle lie that went with it. The Chicago Tribune lay folded beside his plate, headlines promising more bad news from Vietnam, more protests on college campuses, more of the world changing in ways he wasn't sure he understood. The front page carried a photograph of soldiers in mud-soaked fatigues, boys who looked barely older than the high school students he saw waiting for the bus each morning. Margaret cracked 2 eggs into the skillet, the white sizzling against the hot metal. "Tommy's got that field trip to the Museum of Science and Industry today. Needs 50 cents for the bus and admission." "Field trip, huh?" Michael reached for his wallet, finding the familiar weight of responsibility in the gesture. 50 cents for a field trip. 75 cents for Tommy's lunch money this week. $1.30 for Sarah's new school shoes because her feet seemed to grow overnight. The mathematics of family life, calculated in quarters and careful planning. The radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life as Margaret turned the dial to WGN. "Good morning, Chicago. It's Monday, November 7th, 1966, and you're listening to your morning voice, Bob Collins. It's a chilly 34 degrees out there, folks, with snow in the forecast for later this week. Let's start your day with something to warm you up. Here's the mamas and the papas with Monday, Monday." The familiar melody filled the kitchen as Margaret slid the eggs onto his plate beside 2 slices of Wonder Bread toast, golden with butter. She'd arranged everything just so. The eggs over easy but not runny, the toast cut diagonally, a small glass of orange juice from the concentrate they mixed in the blue plastic pitcher. It was the same breakfast she'd made him for 8 years, and he loved her for the consistency of it, the way it anchored the start of each day. "Daddy!" Tommy burst into the kitchen like a small hurricane, his cowboy pajamas wrinkled from sleep, brown hair sticking up in 17 different directions. At 7 years old, he moved through the world with the kind of energy that made Michael wonder where it all went when you got older. "Morning, cowpoke." Michael ruffled his son's hair, making it stick up even more. "I hear you're going on an adventure today. We're going to see rockets and submarines and everything." Tommy climbed onto his chair, legs swinging. "Bobby Peterson says they got a real U-boat there, like from the war." "A U-boat, eh?" Michael spread jam on his toast, remembering his own father's stories about the war, the Pacific Theater where Patrick O'Connor had served as a radio man on a destroyer, before coming home to marry Michael's mother and work 26 years at the Hawthorne Works plant. "You pay attention to everything they tell you, okay? Learning's important." Sarah appeared in the doorway, dragging her favorite doll by one arm. At 4, she was all curls and serious eyes, studying the world with the intensity of someone trying to figure out where exactly she fit in it. "Mummy, can I have pancakes?" "Eggs and toast today, sweetheart." Margaret lifted Sarah onto her booster seat. "Pancakes are for Saturdays, remember?" The morning routine unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. Margaret packed Tommy's lunch in the metal lunchbox decorated with cowboys and Indians, a bologna sandwich with mustard, an apple, a thermos of milk, and 2 Oreo cookies wrapped in wax paper. She fixed Sarah's hair with the patience that came from years of practice, taming the curls into something resembling respectability. Michael finished his breakfast and retreated to the small hallway mirror to tie his tie, navy blue with thin diagonal stripes, the one Margaret had bought him last Christmas. His reflection stared back, 34 years old, face still lean, but showing the first lines around his eyes, shoulders broad from the construction work he'd done before landing the job at Morrison & Associates. His father's face, his mother often said, but with his mother's careful eyes. The Chicago Tribune beckoned from the kitchen table. Michael folded it under his arm as he kissed Margaret goodbye, her lips soft and familiar, tasting faintly of the Folgers coffee they shared. He ruffled Tommy's hair again, kissed Sarah's forehead, and stepped out into the November morning. Ashland Avenue was coming alive around him. Mrs. Kowalski from next door was already sweeping her front steps, even though they were clean yesterday and would need sweeping again tomorrow. 2 houses down, old Mr. Brennan was warming up his '59 Buick, the engine coughing like a chain smoker in the cold air. Children bundled in thick coats walked toward the bus stop, their breath making small clouds in the frigid air. The bus stop sat at the corner of Ashland and 47th Street, beneath a stop sign that had been dinged by countless car doors and tagged with the initials of neighborhood kids proclaiming their territory. Michael recognized the familiar faces waiting there. Mrs. Patterson, who worked downtown at Carson Peary Scott and always carried the largest purse he'd ever seen. Jake Morrison, no relation to the Morrison of Morrison & Associates, who operated heavy machinery at the steel plant. And Betty Richards, a secretary at one of the big law firms who read romance novels on the bus and thought nobody noticed. The CTA bus wheezed to a stop, its brakes sighing like a tired old man. Michael climbed the 3 steps, dropped his 15 cents into the fare box and found a seat halfway back. The bus lurched into motion, carrying its load of working Chicago toward the loop, each passenger lost in their own morning thoughts. Through the scratched window, Michael watched the city transform from residential to commercial. The small houses with their postage stamp yards gave way to storefronts advertising haircuts for $1.50 and hamburgers for 39 cents. The Woolworths on Western Avenue was already opening its doors, the manager in his white shirt and thin black tie unlocking the security gate. A group of teenagers waited at the bus stop, probably late for school, the boys in leather jackets trying to look tough, the girls in bright wool coats that their mothers had probably stayed up late, altering to be fashionable. The man beside him, Frank Kowalski, who worked maintenance at the Board of Trade, was already complaining about his supervisor, a litany that Michael had heard variations of for the past 6 months. "I'm telling you, Mike, the guy's got it in for me. Just 'cause I took an extra 10 minutes at lunch last Tuesday, he's got me scrubbing floors like I'm some kind of rookie. 23 years I've been with the company, 23 years, and he treats me like I don't know which end of a mop to hold." Michael nodded at appropriate intervals, making the small sounds of sympathy that kept Frank talking. The truth was, Frank probably had taken more than 10 minutes at lunch, probably did it regularly, and probably deserved whatever grief his supervisor was giving him. But Michael understood the need to complain, to voice the small frustrations that accumulated like dust in the corners of a working man's life. "You're lucky, working for that fancy accounting firm," Frank continued. "Nice clean office, no heavy lifting, probably got one of them secretary gals bringing you coffee." "It's not quite like that," Michael said, though he didn't elaborate. Morrison & Associates was indeed a step up from the construction work he'd done in his 20s, but it came with its own pressures, its own complications that Frank wouldn't understand. Like the audit that had been keeping Michael awake at night, the irregularities he'd discovered in the books, the growing suspicion that his boss, Harold Harrison, was not the upstanding pillar of business ethics that he appeared to be. The bus turned onto State Street, entering the canyon of Chicago's Loop. The buildings rose on either side like concrete and steel cliffs, their windows catching the pale November sun and throwing it back in fractured patterns. The sidewalks were already filling with the early shift, office workers clutching coffee cups and briefcases, shop clerks hurrying to open their stores, businessmen in expensive overcoats striding purposefully toward whatever deals waited for them. Morrison and Associates occupied the 14th floor of the Monadnock building, a Chicago landmark that stood like a brown brick monument to the city's commercial ambition. Michael rode the elevator up with a handful of other early arrivals, the operator calling out floors in a voice that suggested he'd been doing this job since the building opened in 1893. The office was a maze of wooden desks arranged in neat rows, each topped with a black Royal typewriter and a metal in-basket that was perpetually full. The walls were painted institutional green, broken by motivational posters that someone in management thought would boost morale. Teamwork, over a picture of rowers in perfect synchronization, persistence, beside a photograph of a mountain climber scaling an impossible cliff. Michael's desk sat in the third row, near the window that offered a view of the alley behind the building. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his, the place where he spent 8 hours a day turning numbers into stories, making sense of the financial narratives that businesses told themselves and their investors. His morning ritual was as precise as the one at home. Hang his coat on the back of his chair, place his briefcase beside the desk, arrange his tools, sharp pencils, pink erasers, the slide rule that had belonged to his father-in-law. The Chicago Tribune got folded and placed in the top drawer. He'd read it properly during lunch break. The audit files sat in his in-basket, like a reproach. For 3 weeks, Michael had been working his way through Morrison and Associates' handling of the Veterans Family Relief Fund, a government contract that was supposed to provide financial assistance to the widows and children of soldiers killed in Vietnam. It was good work, important work, the kind of thing that made Michael proud to be part of the firm, until he'd started finding the discrepancies. Small at first, a few dollars here and there that didn't quite add up. Expenses that seemed inflated, charges for services that had questionable documentation. Michael had approached each irregularity with the careful methodology that made him a good accountant, double-checking his math, looking for innocent explanations. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. "Morning, O'Connor," Harold Harrison's voice boomed across the office like a foghorn. At 55, Harrison was everything that Michael aspired to be. Successful, confident, driving a new Cadillac and living in a house in Winnetka that was probably worth more than Michael would earn in 10 years. His suits were tailored, his shoes were always polished, and he had the kind of handshake that suggested he'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with determination and good old American know-how. "Morning, Mr. Harrison. How's that relief fund audit coming along? Board meetings next Friday, and I want to show those government fellows that we run a tight ship here." Michael felt his stomach tighten. "Making good progress, sir. Should have everything wrapped up by Thursday." "Excellent." Harrison clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be encouraging but felt more like a weight. "I knew I could count on you, Mike. You've got a good head for this kind of detailed work." As Harrison walked away, Michael opened the first file of the day. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, widow of Sergeant James Kellerman, killed by sniper fire outside Da Nang in August. 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 12. According to the paperwork, Mrs. Kellerman should have received $847 in assistance over the past 4 months. According to the bank records Michael had carefully cross-referenced, she'd received $612. The missing $235 wasn't much in the grand scheme of Morrison and Associates' multi-million-dollar operation. But for Dorothy Kellerman, trying to raise 3 children on a grocery store clerk's wages, it might mean the difference between keeping the lights on and sitting in the dark. Michael rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar headache building behind his eyes. He pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and began making notes, his neat handwriting documenting each discrepancy with the precision that had made him valuable to the firm. The morning passed in a blur of numbers and growing unease. File after file revealed the same pattern. Small amounts skimmed from payments to widows, orphans, families already devastated by loss. By themselves, the discrepancies might have been explained as clerical errors, sloppy bookkeeping, the kind of mistakes that happened in any large operation. But taken together, they painted a picture that made Michael's coffee taste like bitter ash in his mouth. At 11:30, He needed air. The office felt suddenly stifling, the fluorescent lights too bright, the click of typewriter keys too loud. He told his supervisor he was taking an early lunch and made his way down to the street. The November wind hit him like a slap, cutting through his wool coat and reminding him that winter was coming whether Chicago was ready or not. He walked without purpose, letting his feet carry him away from the Monadnock building and the weight of what he was discovering. He found himself at Grant Park, where the bare trees stood like silent witnesses to the city's struggles. In the distance, Lake Michigan stretched gray and endless, its surface choppy with whitecaps that spoke of storms brewing somewhere beyond the horizon. A few hardy souls were still walking their dogs despite the cold, bundled figures moving through the November landscape like survivors of some unspecified disaster. Michael sat on a bench and pulled out the Tribune, finally giving himself permission to read the news he'd been avoiding all morning. The headlines were no better in daylight. U.S. troop strength in Vietnam reaches 385,000. Anti-war protesters clash with police in Berkeley. Draft calls to increase for December. 385,000 American boys in a jungle on the other side of the world, fighting a war that most people back home didn't understand, for reasons that seemed to change every time someone tried to explain them. And every day, some of those boys didn't come home. Every day, Western Union delivered telegrams that began, "The Secretary of the Army regrets to inform you," and ended with families destroyed, lives shattered, children who would grow up without fathers. Those were the families that the Veterans Family Relief Fund was supposed to help. Those were the widows and children whose assistance payments were being skimmed, dollar by dollar, by someone who was supposed to be protecting them, someone like Harold Harrison. Michael folded the newspaper and stared out at the lake. A tugboat was making its way toward the harbor, black smoke trailing from its stack like a funeral banner. Somewhere in the city, Dorothy Kellerman was probably getting ready for her evening shift at the grocery store, leaving her 3 children with a neighbor who watched them for free because that was what neighbors did when tragedy struck too close to home. And somewhere else, Harold Harrison was probably having lunch at the Union League Club, discussing business deals and golf handicaps with other successful men who drove Cadillacs and lived in houses with circular driveways. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow and the promise of a hard winter. Michael buttoned his coat and began the walk back to the office, knowing that he couldn't unsee what he'd already discovered, couldn't unknow what he now knew. The afternoon stretched ahead like a prison sentence. More files, more discrepancies, more evidence of systematic theft from people who could least afford to lose even a few dollars. By closing time, Michael's legal pad was covered with notes, figures, cross-references that painted a picture he desperately wanted to be wrong about. But the numbers didn't lie. They never did. Harrison stopped by his desk at 4:45, 15 minutes before quitting time. "How's it looking, Mike? Everything adding up the way it should?" Michael met his boss's eyes, searching for some sign of guilt, some tell that would confirm what the audit was revealing. But Harrison's face was open, friendly, concerned in the way that successful men learn to be when dealing with their employees. "Still working through it, Mr. Harrison. Complex operation, lot of moving parts. I'm sure you'll get it sorted out. You always do." Harrison smiled, and for a moment Michael wondered if he was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation for everything he'd found. Then Harrison added, "When you're finished with the report, bring it directly to me. I want to review it personally before it goes to the board." After Harrison left, Michael sat staring at the audit files until the office emptied around him. The cleaning crew arrived at 6, elderly women in worn coats who emptied trash cans and dusted desks, and probably went home to families that needed every dollar they earned. Finally, Michael gathered his things and made the journey in reverse. Elevator to the lobby, bus stop in the gathering dusk, the familiar ride home through neighborhoods where lights were beginning to come on in kitchen windows, and families were gathering for dinner. Ashland Avenue welcomed him with the promise of normalcy. Margaret's silhouette moved behind the curtains of their living room, and he could see Tommy's bicycle on the front porch, where he'd left it despite being told a dozen times to put it in the garage. But as Michael climbed the front steps of his home, he carried with him the weight of what he'd discovered and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same. The audit was nearly complete, and soon he would have to decide what to do with the truth he'd uncovered. The truth about Harold Harrison, the truth about Morrison and Associates, The truth about the money that was supposed to help families like Dorothy Kellerman's and instead was disappearing into someone else's pockets. The front door opened before he could reach for his key, and Margaret stood there with her apron tied around her waist and flour on her hands, looking like every good thing he'd ever wanted in his life. "Perfect timing," she said, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Dinner's almost ready." But as Michael hung up his coat and prepared to join his family around the dinner table, he knew that nothing about this day, or the days to come, would be simple anymore. The next morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Michael had spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to Margaret's steady breathing beside him, and the occasional creak of their small house settling into the November cold. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw numbers, the neat columns of figures that told the story of families betrayed by the very system meant to protect them. At 3:17 a.m., he had slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen, where he sat at the table with a cup of instant coffee and the weight of his discovery. The moonlight streaming through the window cast everything in silver and shadow, making his familiar kitchen seem like a foreign country. He thought about Dorothy Kellerman, somewhere across the city in her 2-room apartment, probably lying awake herself wondering how she would make the rent this month. Her husband Stanley had been just 23 when the sniper's bullet found him outside Da Nang. 23 years old, the same age Michael had been when he married Margaret at St. Mary's, when the whole world seemed full of promise and possibility. Now Stanley was buried in Graceland Cemetery, and Dorothy was working double shifts at Kroger to feed 3 children who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. The assistance money from the Veterans Family Relief Fund was supposed to help bridge that impossible gap between grief and survival. Instead, Harold Harrison was using it to finance his vacation home in Wisconsin. By dawn, his decision was made. Margaret found him there when she came down to start breakfast, still in his pajamas and robe, staring at the cold coffee in his cup. She moved around the kitchen with her usual morning efficiency, starting the percolator, checking the refrigerator for eggs. But he could feel her watching him with the careful attention of a wife who had learned to read her husband's moods. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd felt him tossing and turning, heard him get up in the small hours. "Work stuff," he said, which was true enough. She poured fresh coffee from the percolator, the familiar ritual taking on new significance in the pale morning light. "Michael." Her voice was soft but firm. "What's really going on?" He looked up at her, his wife of 8 years, mother of his children, the anchor that kept him steady in all weather. She was still beautiful in the morning light, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, but there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when they married. Lines that came from worrying about mortgage payments and doctor bills and whether Tommy's shoes would last another month. Margaret had grown up in Bridgeport, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had worked their fingers to the bone in the stockyards and the steel mills. She understood sacrifice, understood the weight that came with providing for a family, but she also understood right from wrong with the clarity that came from growing up in a household where the difference between the two was never negotiable. "If I tell you something," he said slowly, "something that might change everything for us, will you help me figure out what to do?" Margaret sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. The morning light caught the simple gold band on her ring finger, the wedding ring they'd bought for $12 at Woolworths, because that was all they could afford. "You're scaring me, Michael." So he told her. Everything. The audit, the missing money, the families who were being cheated out of assistance they desperately needed. He told her about Dorothy Kellerman and her 3 children, about the pattern of theft that reached back months, maybe years. He told her about the other families, Rose Martinez, whose husband had died at Ia Drang, leaving her with twin daughters and a son with cerebral palsy, Robert Washington, the elderly father caring for his grandson after his son was killed in Quang Tri Province, Maria Santos, the young widow who cleaned offices at night because that was the only job she could find that let her be home during the day with her baby. He told her about Harrison's request to review the report personally and what that might mean. He told her about the sleepless nights, the growing weight of knowledge that seemed to press down on his chest like a stone. When he finished, Margaret was quiet for a long time. Upstairs, they could hear Tommy stirring in his bed, and soon he would come tumbling down the stairs demanding pancakes or cereal or whatever his 7-year-old heart desired. Sarah would follow, dragging her doll and asking for help with her shoes. The normal morning routine would begin, but nothing would ever be normal again. "How much money are we talking about?" Margaret finally asked. "Overall? Maybe $40,000-$50,000, skimmed off over the past year and a half." Margaret's intake of breath was sharp. $50,000 was more money than either of them could imagine having at one time. It was enough to buy a house, send both children to college, live comfortably for years. "And if you report it?" Michael met her eyes. "Harrison will deny everything. He'll say I made mistakes in the audit, that I'm incompetent or worse. He's got connections, Margaret. Friends on the board, golf buddies who run other companies. One word from him and I'll never work as an accountant in this city again. And if you don't report it, those families keep getting cheated." Dorothy Kellerman keeps wondering why her assistance check is smaller than it should be. Other widows, other children, they all keep paying for someone else's greed. Margaret was quiet again, turning her coffee cup in her hands. The kitchen around them told the story of their life together. The yellow curtains she'd sewn herself, the mismatched chairs they'd bought at a church rummage sale, the refrigerator covered with Tommy's crayon drawings of cowboys and soldiers. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, built with honest work and careful budgeting. "What would your father do?" she asked finally. Michael's father had died when Michael was 16, killed in an industrial accident at the Hawthorne Works plant, where he'd worked for 26 years. Patrick O'Connor had been a union man, a believer in fair wages for honest work, a man who had never compromised his principles, even when it cost him promotions or raises. "Dad would do the right thing," Michael said, "even if it killed him." It did kill him in a way. Margaret's voice was gentle but honest. "He could have taken that supervisor job, moved us to a better neighborhood, given you more opportunities. But he wouldn't cross the picket line during the strike in '58, and they never forgave him for that." Michael nodded. He remembered that strike, remembered the tension in the house as the bills piled up, and his father walked the line with the other workers, demanding better safety conditions and fair treatment. For 6 weeks, the family had lived on beans and potatoes, while Patrick O'Connor stood with his union brothers, refusing management's offers to return to work while others stayed out. The strike had been successful. The workers had won better safety protections and a modest wage increase. But Patrick O'Connor had been marked as a troublemaker, passed over for every promotion, until the day a poorly maintained machine crushed the life out of him because the company had decided safety upgrades were too expensive. "So what are you asking me, Margaret? To tell you it's okay to look the other way, to keep quiet and protect our family?" She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm and calloused from housework, hands that had never stopped working since the day they married. She'd grown up washing other people's clothes to help pay the family's bills, had worked as a waitress at night while Michael went to accounting school, had stretched every dollar until it screamed. "I'm asking you to be the man I married," she said. "The man who walked me home from St. Mary's every Sunday for 6 months before he worked up the courage to ask me on a real date. The man who worked construction during the day and went to school at night because he wanted to build a better life for his family. The man who cried when Tommy was born because he was so grateful for the gift of being a father. That man might not be able to provide for his family much longer. That man will find a way, he always has." Her grip on his hand tightened. "Michael, when we got married, we promised to love each other for richer or poorer. We've been poor before. We can be poor again if we have to, but I can't be married to a man who lets families suffer so we can live more comfortably." From upstairs came the sound of small feet hitting the floor, followed by Tommy's voice calling for his parents. The day was beginning, and with it all the small responsibilities and joys that made up their life. "Besides," Margaret added, standing to start breakfast, "those children upstairs need to know that their father is the kind of man who does the right thing. That's worth more than money." Tommy's footsteps thundered down the stairs, followed by Sarah's lighter steps. The morning routine began: breakfast, getting dressed, the search for Tommy's other shoe, Sarah's insistence that her doll needed breakfast too. But underneath the familiar chaos, Michael felt something settling into place, a sense of certainty that had been missing for weeks. The bus ride to work felt different that morning. The same faces, the same stops, the same rhythm of the city waking up around him. But Michael carried with him the knowledge that this might be one of his last rides to Morrison and Associates, one of his last days in the job that had given his family stability and hope for the future. Frank Kowalski was complaining again, this time about his wife's cooking and how she never made anything he actually wanted to eat. Last night, she gives me some kind of casserole with tuna fish and noodles. Tuna fish? What am I, a cat? I asked her for a nice pot roast, maybe some potatoes. Instead, I get cat food with macaroni. Michael barely heard him. He was thinking about Dorothy Kellerman and her 3 children, about all the other families whose names were in his files, whose lives had been made harder by someone else's greed. He was thinking about the meeting he would have to have with Harrison, the conversation that would end his career at Morrison and Associates and possibly destroy his future in accounting. But he was also thinking about the conversation he'd had with Margaret, about the look in her eyes when she'd told him to be the man she married. There were worse things than being poor. There were worse things than starting over. The Loop was already bustling with morning activity when Michael arrived at the Monadnock building. The elevator carried him to the 14th floor with its familiar cargo of tired faces and hopeful ambitions. The Morrison and Associates office buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy. Typewriters clattered, phones rang, conversations about weekend activities and upcoming holidays filled the air. Michael took his place at his desk and opened the audit files one final time, double-checking his work, making sure every detail was correct. The mathematics of theft were ruthless in their clarity. Over the past 14 months, Harold Harrison had diverted $47,231 from the Veterans Family Relief Fund into various fictional expenses and inflated charges. The method was sophisticated, but not foolproof. Invoices for maintenance work that had never been performed, charges for supplies that had never been delivered, consultant fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. The money had disappeared into a maze of subsidiary accounts and contractor payments, all designed to look legitimate on the surface. But Michael had followed the paper trail with the persistence his father had taught him. He'd cross-referenced every invoice with delivery records, checked contractor licenses, verified addresses. The money had ended up in an account controlled by Harrison's brother-in-law's construction company, which had supposedly done extensive maintenance work on Morrison and Associates offices, work that the building's actual maintenance staff knew nothing about. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its impact. $47,000 that should have gone to families struggling to rebuild their lives after losing husbands and fathers to a war that seemed increasingly pointless with each passing day. Michael pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and began making his final notes, organizing his thoughts for the report he would have to write. Each family's story was there in the numbers. Dorothy Kellerman, short $347 over 6 months. Rose Martinez, missing $428. Robert Washington cheated out of $291. Small amounts individually, but collectively representing groceries that couldn't be bought, rent that couldn't be paid, medical bills that had to go unpaid. At 10:30, Michael walked to the supply closet and retrieved a box of carbon paper. He inserted 4 sheets into his typewriter and began typing his report. 2. Board of Directors, Morrison and Associates, from Michael P. O'Connor, Senior Accountant RE, Veterans Family Relief Fund Audit, Final Report. Date, November 8, 1966. Gentlemen, I have completed my audit of the firm's handling of the Veterans Family Relief Fund contract. It is my professional opinion that systematic irregularities have occurred in the administration of this fund, resulting in the misdirection of monies intended for the families of deceased servicemen. The scope of these irregularities extends over a period of 14 months, from September 1965 to November 1966. The total amount of misdirected funds is $47,231. Attached to this report are detailed schedules showing 1. Invoices submitted for payment with no corresponding services rendered. 2. Inflated charges for legitimate services. 3. Payments made to entities with questionable legitimacy. A reconciliation of amounts that should have been distributed to beneficiary families versus amounts actually distributed. It is my professional recommendation that this matter be immediately referred to the appropriate federal authorities for investigation. The families who have been shortchanged deserve to receive the full assistance to which they are legally entitled. I stand ready to provide any additional documentation or testimony that may be required to ensure that justice is served and that the integrity of the Veterans Family Relief Fund is restored. Michael typed for 3 hours, documenting every discrepancy, every false invoice, every diverted payment. The report grew to 18 pages, a comprehensive indictment backed by irrefutable evidence. When he finished, he made 3 additional copies using the carbon paper, sealing one in an envelope addressed to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, another addressed to the Chicago Tribune's investigative reporter who had been covering government contracting scandals, and a third that would go to his safe deposit box at First National Bank. The office lunch hour was beginning as Michael finished his work. Around him, his colleagues were pulling out brown bag lunches or making plans to walk to the cafeteria on the 5th floor. Normal people doing normal things, unaware that their company was about to be destroyed by the contents of the envelope sitting on Michael's desk. He thought about these people. Betty Patterson, the secretary who sent half her salary to her elderly mother in Springfield. Jim Crawford, who had 3 children and a wife with diabetes. Susan Morrison, Harold Harrison's own niece, fresh out of secretarial school and saving money for her wedding. They would all lose their jobs when the scandal broke, all become casualties of someone else's greed. But Dorothy Kellerman had already lost her husband. Rose Martinez was already working 16-hour days to keep food on the table for her children. The choice had been made long before Michael sat down at his typewriter. At 1:15, Harold Harrison appeared at his desk, looking prosperous and confident in his tailored suit and gold tie clip. At 55, Harrison was everything that Michael had once aspired to be: successful, respected, driving a new Cadillac DeVille and living in a house in Winnetka that was featured in the society pages. "How's that report coming, Mike? I'm anxious to see what you've put together." Michael looked up at his boss, the man who had given him opportunities, who had trusted him with important work, who had seemed like everything Michael wanted to become. Harrison's face was open and friendly, showing no sign of guilt or concern. Either he was a master actor, or he had convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really stealing. "It's finished, Mr. Harrison." Michael held up the original report, 18 pages of carefully documented evidence. "I think you'll find it very thorough." Harrison's smile widened. "Excellent. I knew I could count on you. Why don't you bring it to my office so we can go over it together? I like to review these government reports personally before they go to the board." Michael followed Harrison through the maze of desks to the corner office, with its view of the Chicago River, and its walls lined with certificates and photographs of Harrison shaking hands with politicians and businessmen. A picture of Harrison's family sat prominently on his desk, his wife Patricia in her pearls and tweed suit, their 2 daughters blonde and smiling in their Sacred Heart Academy uniforms. The office was a shrine to American success: leather-bound law books, a putting green in the corner for practicing his golf swing, a bar cart with crystal decanters of expensive whiskey. The American flag stood in one corner, next to a framed photograph of Harrison receiving some civic award from the mayor. Harrison closed the door behind them and gestured for Michael to take a seat in the leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. "Coffee? I just had my secretary make a fresh pot. Best Brazilian blend money can buy." "No, thank you, Mr. Harrison." "Well then, let's see what you've discovered." Harrison reached for the report with the casual confidence of a man who had never doubted his own invincibility. Michael watched Harrison's face as he read. The friendly smile faded first, replaced by a puzzled frown as he worked through the first page. Then came the tightening around the eyes as the implications became clear. His face went pale as he turned to the detailed schedules that documented each fraudulent transaction. By page 10, his hands were trembling slightly. The office was completely quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of traffic on LaSalle Street. Harrison read every page, his face growing grayer with each revelation. When he finally looked up, his expression was carefully neutral, but Michael could see the fear behind his eyes. "This is quite detailed work, Mike. Very thorough indeed." He set the report down on his desk and leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, what conclusions have you drawn from all these irregularities?" "I think the numbers speak for themselves, Mr. Harrison." Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Michael with the kind of attention he usually reserved for important contracts. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk, and Michael could see him calculating, trying to find an angle, a way out of the trap that had closed around him. Finally, Harrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out his personal checkbook, the expensive leather kind, with his initials embossed in gold. You know, Mike, I've been thinking about your future here at Morrison & Associates. You're a valuable employee, someone with real potential. He began writing in the checkbook with quick, nervous strokes. I think it's time we discussed a promotion. Senior accountant with your own office, maybe even a company car. The board has been very impressed with your work. He tore off the check and slid it across the desk. Michael glanced down and saw his own name written in Harrison's careful script, followed by a figure that made his breath catch. $8,000. $8,000. More money than his father had made in 2 years at the plant. Enough to buy the house in Oak Park that Margaret sometimes talked about. Enough to ensure Tommy and Sarah had everything they needed and more. Enough to pay for college educations, to secure their future in ways that Michael's steady accountant salary never could. Consider it a bonus for your excellent work on this audit, Harrison continued, his voice taking on the smooth tone he used with important clients. And there would be more where that came from, of course. A man with your skills, your discretion, could go far in this business, very far indeed. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. Mike, you're a smart man. You understand how the world works. Sometimes there are gray areas in business. Opportunities that present themselves to men with vision. What you've found here, it's not really theft. It's more like creative accounting, moving money around to where it can do the most good. The most good for who, Mr. Harrison? For everyone. The company prospers, which means job security for all our employees. I prosper, which means I can afford to be generous with talented people like you. It's the American way, Mike. Success breeding more success. Harrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. Do you see all those people down there? They're all trying to get ahead, trying to build better lives for their families. The successful ones, the ones who really make it, they're the ones who understand that sometimes you have to bend the rules a little. That's just reality. He turned back to Michael, his face earnest and persuasive. Those families you're worried about, they're getting assistance. Maybe not every penny they're technically entitled to, but they're getting help. And if Morrison & Associates goes under because of some government investigation, who's going to help them then? Who's going to administer their fund when we're gone? Michael stared at the check, feeling the weight of it between his fingers. $8,000 that could transform his family's life, that could lift them out of the constant worry about money, that could give his children opportunities he'd never had. All I need from you, Harrison continued, returning to his chair, is a revised version of this report, something that focuses on the positive aspects of our administration of the fund. Perhaps we could frame those irregularities as procedural improvements that need to be implemented, rather than, he gestured at the report, rather than whatever this seems to be suggesting. Michael looked around the office, taking in all the symbols of success that surrounded him. This could be his someday. The corner office, the view of the river, the respect that came with real money and influence. All he had to do was rewrite a few numbers, soften a few conclusions, look the other way just this once. He thought about Margaret at home, probably preparing dinner and helping the children with their homework. Tommy needed new winter boots. His current ones had holes that let in the cold and wet. Sarah's doll was missing an arm, and she kept asking when they could take it to the doll hospital to get it fixed. The house needed a new roof. Every time it rained, they had to put pots and pans out to catch the leaks. $8,000 would solve all of those problems and more. But then he thought about Dorothy Kellerman, somewhere across the city, getting ready for her evening shift at Kroger. Her husband Stanley was buried in Graceland Cemetery, and she was raising 3 children alone on what little money she could earn stocking shelves and cleaning floors. The assistance she was supposed to receive from the Veterans Family Relief Fund wasn't charity. It was money she had earned through her husband's sacrifice, money that belonged to her children. Mr. Harrison, Michael said quietly, Dorothy Kellerman has 3 children. Her husband died at Kaisan in August, and she's been waiting for assistance money that you've been stealing. She works double shifts at a grocery store to pay rent on a 2-room apartment, and she still can't afford to buy her kids winter coats. Harrison's face hardened. I don't know what you think you've discovered, O'Connor, but I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Slander is a serious charge. I can prove every number in this report, every invoice, every payment, every dollar that was diverted into your brother-in-law's account. Michael stood up, still holding the check. The question is what I'm going to do with that proof. The question, Harrison said, his voice taking on a steel edge, is whether you want to keep working in this city. I have friends, Mike. Important friends. One phone call from me, and you'll never get another accounting job anywhere in Chicago. Maybe anywhere in Illinois. You'll be lucky to find work as a bookkeeper for some two-bit operation in Iowa. Harrison stood and walked to his wall of photographs, pointing to a picture of himself shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. See this? That's William Morrison, president of First National Bank. We golf together every Saturday. This one here? That's Judge Patterson from the Circuit Court. We were roommates at Northwestern. And this one is Congressman Bradley, who happens to sit on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. He turned back to Michael, his smile cold and calculating. You're a small fish in a very big pond, O'Connor. You think you can take me down with your little audit? I've got lawyers who eat government investigators for breakfast. I've got connections that reach all the way to Washington. One word from me, and that report of yours disappears into a filing cabinet where it will never see the light of day. Michael nodded slowly. I figured as much. He looked down at the check one more time, at the figure that represented security and comfort and everything he'd ever wanted for his family. Then he tore it in half, the sound loud in the quiet office. He tore it again and again, letting the pieces flutter down onto Harrison's expensive Persian carpet. I'll need those copies you made, Harrison said, his voice barely controlled. What copies? Don't play games with me, O'Connor. Nobody types a report that sensitive without making copies. Where are they? Michael smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. You're right about that, Mr. Harrison. I did make copies, several of them, actually. Harrison's face went white. What have you done? I've mailed one copy to the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, another to Bob Greene at the Chicago Tribune, and a third to Senator Douglas's office. The fourth copy is in my safe deposit box at First National Bank, along with a letter explaining the circumstances under which I discovered your theft. For a moment, Michael thought Harrison might actually strike him. The older man's hands clenched into fists, and his face flushed red with rage and fear. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You have no idea what you've done. No idea at all. I know exactly what I've done, Mr. Harrison. I've done my job. Harrison slumped into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. Do you understand what this means? Morrison and Associates will be finished. 73 people work here, Mike. 73 families who depend on this company for their livelihoods. You're not just destroying me. You're destroying all of them. You destroyed them the minute you started stealing from war widows. I just documented it. Those people trusted me. Patricia, my daughters. What am I supposed to tell them? That their husband and father is going to prison. That we'll lose the house, the cars, everything we've built. Michael felt a flicker of sympathy for the man across the desk, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the image of Dorothy Kellerman's 3 children wondering why they couldn't have new winter coats like the other kids at school. What were you planning to tell Stanley Kellerman's children when they asked why their assistance checks were so small? What about Maria Santos's baby, who needs medicine that she can't afford because you stole her assistance money? Harrison looked up at him with eyes that had lost all their earlier confidence. It was just supposed to be temporary. A loan, really. I was going to pay it all back once the Winnetka property deal went through. Nobody was going to get hurt permanently. Except those families are hurting now, today, while you're driving your Cadillac and playing golf at the country club. Michael walked to the door, then turned back. I'll clean out my desk and be gone by the end of the day. I assume you'll want to handle my termination personally. O'Connor. Harrison's voice stopped him at the door. This isn't over. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a fool who's destroyed his own family for the sake of strangers you'll never meet. You'll never work in this city again, never. I'll make sure of that. Maybe so, Michael said, but I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror tomorrow morning. Can you say the same? The walk back to his desk felt like a journey through a foreign country. His co-workers looked the same. Their conversations continued unchanged, but Michael felt as if he was seeing everything through new eyes. These people, his colleagues for 8 years, would they have made the same choice? Would they have torn up that check, walked away from the promotion, risked everything for the sake of principle? He didn't know, and it didn't matter. He had made his choice. Betty Patterson looked up from her typing as he passed her desk. Everything all right, Michael? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just tired, Betty. Long day. She smiled sympathetically. Tell me about it. I've been typing invoices all morning. Sometimes I think these numbers are going to drive me crazy." Michael nodded and continued to his desk, thinking about all the invoices Betty had typed over the years, including probably some of the fraudulent ones that had funded Harrison's theft. She was innocent, of course, just doing her job, typing what she was told to type. But somehow that made it worse. All these good people doing honest work for a company that was built on lies. Michael cleaned out his desk methodically, packing his personal items into a cardboard box that had once held reams of typing paper. His slide rule, the photograph of Margaret and the children taken last Christmas, the coffee mug with the chip on the handle that Margaret kept threatening to throw away, the small American flag that had belonged to his father. 8 years of his working life reduced to a few possessions that fit in a box small enough to carry under one arm. Jim Crawford stopped by to ask what was happening. "You're not leaving us, are you, Mike? This place wouldn't be the same without you." "Just moving on to new opportunities, Jim. Time for a change." "Well, if you need a reference, you know you can count on me. You're the most honest guy I know." The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Michael. He shook Jim's hand, knowing he might never see him again, knowing that in a few days or weeks Jim would read about Morrison and Associates in the newspaper and wonder if he'd really known Michael O'Connor at all. Susan Morrison appeared at his desk as he was packing the last of his belongings. Harrison's niece was 22 years old, fresh out of Northwestern with dreams of working her way up in the business world. She was smart, ambitious, and completely unaware that her uncle was about to be arrested for federal crimes. "Mr. O'Connor, Uncle Harold asked me to give you this." She handed him an envelope. "He said to tell you that your final paycheck has been adjusted to reflect your early departure." Michael opened the envelope and found his final paycheck, along with a termination letter that cited gross misconduct in the performance of his duties as the reason for his dismissal. The letter would make it nearly impossible for him to find another accounting job, just as Harrison had promised. "Is everything okay?" Susan asked, her young face creased with concern. Uncle Harold seemed really upset about something. Michael looked at her innocent face and wondered what she would think of her uncle in a few weeks when the FBI agents came calling. She would probably never believe it, never accept that the man who had bounced her on his knee when she was little was capable of stealing from war widows. "Everything's fine, Susan, just office politics. Nothing for you to worry about." At 4:30, Michael carried his box to the elevator and rode it down for the last time. The operator, who had been greeting him with the same cheerful "Good morning, Mr. O'Connor" for 8 years, looked puzzled, but said nothing. The November afternoon was crisp and bright, the kind of day that made Chicago look like a city of possibilities rather than broken dreams. Michael walked to the bus stop, balancing his box under one arm and thinking about what he would tell Margaret and the children. The truth, he decided. They deserved that much. But first he made a detour to the Western Union office on State Street. The telegram he sent was brief and to the point. "Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman, 2247. South Halsted Street, Chicago, Illinois. Veterans Assistance irregularities being corrected. Stop full back payments forthcoming. Stop your husband's sacrifice will not be forgotten. Stop, Michael O'Connor." It cost him 75 cents, money he could barely afford now that he was unemployed. But it was worth it to know that Dorothy Kellerman would sleep a little easier tonight, knowing that someone was fighting for her and her children. The bus ride home gave him time to think about the future. Harrison was right about one thing. Finding another accounting job in Chicago would be difficult, maybe impossible once word got out about his role in exposing the Morrison and Associates scandal. But Michael had worked construction before, had skills with his hands that couldn't be taken away by angry phone calls or professional blacklisting. He thought about his father, walking the picket line during the strike of '58, choosing principle over security. Patrick O'Connor had died young and poor, but he had died with his integrity intact. There were worse legacies to leave your children. As the bus wound its way through the familiar neighborhoods toward Ashland Avenue, Michael watched the city change around him. Downtown's steel and glass towers gave way to the smaller commercial buildings of the near South Side, then to the residential streets where working families like his own had built their lives. Children were walking home from school, bundled in jackets and carrying book bags, their voices bright in the cold air. Mothers were hanging laundry despite the November chill, sheets and towels snapping in the wind like flags of domestic perseverance. Old men sat on stoops despite the cold smoking pipes and watching the world go by. This was the America that Michael was fighting for. Not the boardrooms and country clubs where men like Harrison made their deals, but the neighborhoods where real families lived real lives, where children played in the streets and mothers worried about grocery bills and fathers worked honest jobs for honest pay. Ashland Avenue welcomed him home with its familiar sights and sounds. Mrs. Kowalski was sweeping her front steps again, a daily ritual that seemed to give order to her world. 2 houses down, old Mr. Brennan was working on his Buick's engine, his tools spread out on a blanket like a surgeon's instruments. Children's voices echoed from the schoolyard 2 blocks away, the sound of innocence and possibility. Margaret met him at the door, her face immediately registering concern when she saw the box in his arms and the look in his eyes. "Michael, what happened?" "I did the right thing," he said, setting the box down in their small hallway. "And now we'll figure out what comes next." She didn't ask for details, not immediately. Instead, she took his coat and hung it in the closet with the same care she'd shown every evening for 8 years. Tommy and Sarah came running from the living room, where they'd been watching the Mickey Mouse Club on their small Zenith television, and Michael gathered them both in his arms, breathing in the scent of their hair and the warmth of their trust. "Daddy, are you home early?" Sarah asked, her 4-year-old mind trying to process the disruption in routine. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy finished his work early today." "Can we play cowboys and Indians?" Tommy demanded, already pulling on Michael's sleeve. "I'll be the sheriff and you can be the outlaw." "Maybe later, cowpoke. Right now, Daddy needs to talk to Mommy." That evening, after the children were bathed and tucked into bed with their usual bedtime stories, Tommy insisting on another chapter of The Lone Ranger, while Sarah demanded her favorite fairy tale about the princess and the magic shoes, Michael and Margaret sat at their kitchen table and talked about the future. The conversation was practical rather than dramatic. How long their savings would last, maybe 3 months if they were careful. What jobs Michael might be able to find. Construction work was always available for men willing to work hard, though it paid less than accounting and offered no security. Whether they could manage the mortgage payments if he had to take lower-paying work, probably if Margaret took in some sewing or went back to waitressing. "I called my sister in Milwaukee," Margaret said, pouring them each another cup of coffee. "Danny knows a foreman at the brewery, says they're always looking for men who can handle numbers. It wouldn't be accounting exactly, but it would be steady work." Michael nodded, grateful for her practicality. Many wives would have been angry, would have demanded to know how he could throw away their security for the sake of strangers. But Margaret understood him, understood the man she had married. "What about here in Chicago?" he asked. "Any word from your cousin at the phone company? Mary says they might have something in their billing department. It's not much, more like bookkeeping than real accounting, but it's honest work." They talked for hours, planning and strategizing like generals preparing for a siege. The immediate future would be difficult, but not impossible. They had each other, they had their health, and they had skills that couldn't be taken away by hostile references or industry blacklisting. "I'm proud of you," Margaret said finally, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Scared, but proud. I know it's not fair to you and the children. I know I'm asking you to sacrifice for the sake of people you'll never meet." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking around their small kitchen with its yellow curtains and mismatched chairs. "You know what my father told me when I married you? He said, 'Margaret, you're not just marrying a man, you're marrying the kind of man he is.' I married the kind of man who does the right thing, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." She stood and began clearing the coffee cups, her movements efficient and purposeful. "Those children upstairs need to know that their father is the kind of man who stands up for what's right. That's worth more than a fancy house in Oak Park or a new car in the driveway." 2 days later, the first article appeared in the Chicago Tribune. Bob Green, the investigative reporter who had received Michael's copy of the audit report, had worked around the clock to verify the information and contact the affected families. "Veterans Fund Scandal Rocks Accounting Firm," read the headline on page 1. The article detailed the systematic theft of assistance money meant for war widows and orphans, naming Harold Harrison as the primary suspect and Morrison and Associates as the company that had allowed it to happen. Michael read the article at the kitchen table while Margaret made breakfast and the children got ready for school. The reporter had done his job well, presenting the facts clearly and letting the outrage speak for itself. There were quotes from several of the affected families, including Dorothy Kellerman. "My husband died serving his country," she told the Tribune. "The least we can expect is that the money meant to help his children actually reaches them. It's not charity. It's what Stanley earned with his life." The article mentioned Michael only briefly, identifying him as the Morrison and Associates accountant whose internal audit uncovered the irregularities. There was no mention of his dismissal or Harrison's attempts to buy his silence. Michael was grateful for the anonymity. He had no desire to be known as a whistleblower or crusader. The phone began ringing that morning and didn't stop for 3 days. Reporters wanting interviews, government investigators requesting meetings, lawyers representing the affected families seeking his testimony. Michael answered them all politely but briefly, providing the information they needed, but declining to make public statements or appear on television. "I just did my job," he told everyone who asked. "The real heroes are the families who lost their husbands and fathers. They deserve justice, not publicity." On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Michael had confronted Harrison, the FBI arrested the former Morrison and Associates executive at his Winnetka home. The perp walk was captured by television cameras. Harrison in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face gray with fear and shame. His wife Patricia stood in the doorway of their mansion, weeping as her neighbors watched from behind their curtains. Morrison and Associates closed its doors that same day, its remaining clients fleeing to other firms as fast as they could transfer their files. 73 employees lost their jobs, just as Harrison had predicted. Many of them would struggle to find work elsewhere, their resumes tainted by association with the scandal. Michael felt a pang of guilt watching the news coverage of the firm's collapse. These were good people, honest workers who had done nothing wrong except trust their employer. But then he remembered Dorothy Kellerman's children and Rose Martinez working 16-hour days to feed her family, and he knew he had made the right choice. The government investigators were thorough and professional, treating Michael with the respect due to a cooperating witness rather than a troublemaker. They recovered most of the stolen money within 6 weeks, tracing it through Harrison's complicated web of shell companies and fraudulent invoices. The back payments began reaching the affected families in December, just in time for Christmas. Michael never sought credit for his role in the recovery, but Dorothy Kellerman somehow learned his name and address. The Christmas card she sent was simple and heartfelt. "Mr. O'Connor, thank you for remembering that Stanley died for something bigger than himself. Because of you, his children will have the Christmas he would have wanted them to have. God bless you and your family. Dorothy, James, Patricia, and Michael Kellerman." Michael kept that card in his wallet for the rest of his life. Finding new employment proved as difficult as Harrison had promised. Michael's role in exposing the Morrison and Associates scandal had made him a pariah in Chicago's tight-knit accounting community. Firm after firm rejected his applications, often without even granting him an interview. The rejection letters were polite but firm. "While your qualifications are impressive, we feel you would not be a good fit for our corporate culture. We've decided to go with a candidate whose background is more aligned with our company's values. Unfortunately, we have no openings at this time." Michael understood the subtext. He was the man who had turned in his boss, who had chosen principle over loyalty, who had put conscience ahead of corporate solidarity. No accounting firm wanted to hire someone who might do the same thing to them. But Chicago was a working man's city, and there were opportunities for those willing to look beyond the glass towers of the Loop. Through Margaret's network of church friends and family connections, Michael found work with Kowalski Construction, a small firm run by Polish immigrants who valued honesty and hard work above all else. The pay was less than half what he'd made at Morrison and Associates, $60 a week instead of $140. But it was steady work with good people. Michael handled the company's books, managed payroll, and occasionally picked up a hammer to help finish a job when they were behind schedule. Stan Kowalski, the company's owner, was a man who had built his business one foundation at a time, never cutting corners, never compromising on quality. He'd come to America with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable work ethic, and he'd built a reputation for completing every job on time and under budget. "You know why I hire you?" Stan asked Michael. "Not because you're some fancy accountant with degrees on the wall. I hire you because my cousin Frank, he tells me you're the guy who stood up for the war widows. A man who does that, he's not going to cheat me on the books. The work was satisfying in ways that Michael hadn't expected. Instead of managing the finances of abstract corporate entities, he was helping to build things. Houses where families would live, schools where children would learn, churches where communities would gather. Every dollar spent had a purpose he could see and touch. Christmas of 1966 was lean but not cheerless. Michael's reduced salary meant fewer presents under the tree, but there were still enough toys to make Tommy and Sarah squeal with delight on Christmas morning. Margaret had sewn new dresses for Sarah's dolls and knitted sweaters for the whole family. The Christmas dinner was simpler than in previous years. Ham instead of turkey, fewer side dishes, but the table was full of laughter and love. Next year will be better, Margaret promised as they cleaned up after dinner. Things will get easier. But Michael had already learned something important. Easier wasn't necessarily better. The struggle had brought his family closer together, had reminded them what truly mattered. Tommy and Sarah didn't need expensive toys to be happy. They needed parents who loved them and each other. Margaret didn't need a house in Oak Park to be content. She needed to be married to a man she could respect. The legal proceedings against Harold Harrison dragged on for months. Michael testified before a federal grand jury, his words helping to build the case that would eventually send Harrison to federal prison for 5 years. The fallen executive's family lost everything: the house in Winnetka, the vacation home in Wisconsin, the country club membership, the Cadillac. Patricia Harrison filed for divorce 6 months after her husband's arrest, taking their daughters and moving back to her family in Ohio. She sent Michael a brief note through her lawyer. "I want to hate you for what you've done to my family, but I know you were only doing what was right. I pray that someday my daughters will understand that their father brought this on himself." Michael never replied to the note, but he kept it as a reminder that every choice had consequences, that doing the right thing sometimes hurt innocent people as well as guilty ones. The spring of 1967 brought new possibilities. Stan Kowalski's business was growing, fueled by Chicago's post-war building boom and his reputation for quality work. He offered Michael a partnership, a small percentage of ownership in exchange for handling all the company's financial affairs and helping to expand into larger commercial projects. "You make this company grow," Stan said. "You grow with it. Is not charity, is business, good business." The partnership agreement was simple, written on 3 pages of legal paper and sealed with a handshake. Michael would never make as much money as he might have at Morrison & Associates, but he would build something honest and lasting, something he could be proud to leave to his children. Tommy started 3rd grade that fall, already showing his father's aptitude for numbers and his mother's stubborn integrity. When a bigger boy tried to steal his lunch money, Tommy fought back, earning a black eye and his father's quiet approval. Sarah began kindergarten, charming her teachers with her serious questions and careful attention to detail. Margaret found part-time work at the parish school, teaching reading to 1st graders for $15 a week. The money helped, but more importantly, the work gave her a sense of purpose beyond the household. She was good with children, patient and encouraging, and the nuns began hinting that she might consider going back to school herself to get her teaching certificate. "What do you think?" she asked Michael one evening as they walked around the neighborhood after dinner. "The program at Chicago State would take 3 years, but I could do it part-time, mostly evenings and weekends." Michael took her hand, feeling the calluses that had developed from years of housework and penny pinching. "I think you should do whatever makes you happy. We'll figure out the rest." By the autumn of 1967, life had settled into new rhythms. Michael left for work each morning at 7, kissed Margaret goodbye, and drove to the construction sites in the used Ford pickup that Stan had helped him buy. The work was physical and demanding, but it was honest, building things that would last, creating value that people could see and touch. In the evenings, he helped Tommy with his arithmetic homework and listened to Sarah read from her primer. The family gathered around their small television to watch The Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights, Tommy imitating the comedians while Sarah clapped along with the musical acts. Margaret's teaching career flourished. She completed her certification in 1970 and was hired full-time at St. Catherine's School, where she would teach for the next 30 years. Her salary, combined with Michael's growing income from Kowalski Construction, gradually lifted the family into comfortable middle-class prosperity. They never did move to Oak Park, but they renovated their house on Ashland Avenue, adding a second bathroom and refinishing the hardwood floors. The neighborhood changed around them, some families moving to the suburbs, others moving in from the rural south. But the O'Connors remained, becoming pillars of the community. Michael joined the parish council and volunteered as a coach for the CYO Baseball League. Margaret organized the school's annual fundraiser and started a reading program for adults learning English. Tommy and Sarah grew up understanding that their parents were the kind of people who helped others, who stood up for what was right, who measured success by the good they did rather than the money they made. The Vietnam War ended, finally and badly, in 1975. Michael watched the last helicopter leave the embassy roof in Saigon and thought about all the young men who had died for nothing, all the families who had sacrificed for a cause that their own government had abandoned. Dorothy Kellerman's husband Stanley was among them, buried in Graceland Cemetery with thousands of other young men who had believed their country's promises. Harold Harrison was released from federal prison in 1972, his 5-year sentence reduced for good behavior and cooperation with authorities. He moved to Florida, where he worked as a bookkeeper for a small trucking company. His accounting license permanently revoked, his dreams of wealth and power permanently shattered. Michael never saw or spoke to Harrison again, but he occasionally wondered what the man thought about during the long nights in his prison cell, whether he ever understood the true cost of what he had done. The money Harrison had stolen could be repaid, but Stanley Kellerman's children had grown up without their father's presence. Rose Martinez's twins had learned to live with want, and dozens of other families had carried burdens they shouldn't have had to bear. In 1976, as America celebrated its bicentennial, Michael and Margaret celebrated their own milestone, 20 years of marriage. They had a small party in their backyard, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become family over the years. Tommy was 18, a senior in high school with plans to study engineering at Illinois Institute of Technology. Sarah was 16, a straight-A student who talked about becoming a teacher like her mother. "Any regrets?" Margaret asked him that night as they sat on their back porch watching the 4th of July fireworks bloom over the city. Michael thought about the question seriously, as he thought about everything important in his life. He could have been rich by now, could have owned that house in Oak Park, could have sent his children to private schools and taken vacations in Europe. He could have kept quiet about what he discovered at Morrison and Associates, could have taken Harrison's money and lived comfortably with his compromised conscience. "No," he said finally, "no regrets." And he meant it. Tommy graduated from IIT in 1980 with a degree in civil engineering and a job offer from one of Chicago's most prestigious architecture firms. On the day he started work, he called his father from his new office. "Dad, I want you to know something. The reason they hired me wasn't just my grades or my portfolio. It was because of you. The senior partner, Mr. Davidson, he remembers what you did at Morrison and Associates. He said he wanted to work with someone from a family that understood the difference between right and wrong." Michael hung up the phone and wept, the first time he had cried since his father's funeral 34 years earlier. Sarah became a teacher, as she had always planned, but her path was different from her mother's. She joined the Peace Corps after college, spending 2 years in rural Guatemala, teaching literacy to indigenous children. When she returned to Chicago, she worked with immigrant families, helping them navigate the American education system and advocate for their children. "You taught me that sometimes you have to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves," she told Michael on his 60th birthday. "Everything I am, I learned from watching you and Mom." Kowalski Construction grew into one of Chicago's most respected firms, known for quality work and honest dealing. Michael became a full partner in 1985, and when Stan retired 5 years later, he sold his remaining shares to Michael at a price that was more gift than business transaction. "You make this company what it is," the old Polish immigrant said at his retirement party, "is yours now. You keep it honest like we always do." Michael ran the company for another 15 years, building homes and schools and churches throughout the Chicago area. He employed over 100 people at his peak, all of them working for fair wages with good benefits. He never became wealthy in the way that Harold Harrison had been wealthy, but he built something more valuable, a reputation for integrity that opened doors throughout the city. When Michael retired in 2001 at the age of 69, The Chicago Tribune ran a feature article about his life and career. The headline read, "The Accountant Who Chose Conscience Over Comfort." The story detailed his role in exposing the Morrison and Associates scandal and his subsequent career building one of the city's most respected construction companies. But Michael was proudest of a different kind of recognition. At his retirement party, Dorothy Kellerman appeared, now Dorothy Peterson, having remarried a good man who had helped her raise Stanley's 3 children. Her son Michael, named after the accountant who had helped his family, had become a social worker specializing in veterans affairs. "You gave my children their father's legacy," she told Michael that night. "Not just the money you helped us recover, but the knowledge that there are people in the world who will fight for what's right, even when it costs them everything." Margaret and Michael spent their retirement years traveling, but not to Europe or exotic destinations. They drove across America, visiting national parks and small towns, staying in modest motels and eating at local diners. They saw the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone, the Atlantic and the Pacific, the mountains and the plains of the country they had served in their own quiet way. In each place they visited, they found the same thing: ordinary people doing extraordinary things, making choices every day between easy and right, between comfortable and conscience. America, they discovered, was full of people like themselves, people who understood that character was built in small moments of decision, in the private places where no one was watching. Margaret died in 2012, at the age of 78, her hand in Michael's after 54 years of marriage. She had lived to see both her children happily married, to hold 6 grandchildren in her arms, to know that the sacrifices she had made in 1966 had been worth making. Michael lived 4 more years, long enough to walk Sarah's daughter down the aisle at her wedding, long enough to teach Tommy's grandson how to swing a baseball bat, long enough to know that the values he and Margaret had tried to instill would live on in future generations. He died quietly in his sleep on a cold November morning in 2016, exactly 50 years after the day he had first discovered Harold Harrison's theft. His funeral filled St. Mary's Church, the same church where he and Margaret had been married, where their children had been baptized, where they had prayed every Sunday for 60 years. The eulogies were delivered by his children, his grandchildren, former employees, and community leaders whose lives he had touched. But the words that would have meant the most to Michael came from a young man he had never met, Dorothy Kellerman's great-grandson, a Marine who had just returned from Afghanistan. "My great-grandmother always told me about the man who stood up for our family when we had no one else," he said, his dress blue uniform crisp in the morning light streaming through the church's stained glass windows. She said he proved that there are still people in this world who believe that doing right is more important than doing well. I never met Mr. O'Connor, but I served my country because of the example he set. They buried Michael next to Margaret in Calvary Cemetery, under a simple granite headstone that bore only their names, dates, and a single line. They chose love over fear. On the day of the funeral, Dorothy Peterson, now 86, and the last surviving member of the families who had been cheated by Morrison and Associates, placed a small American flag on Michael's grave. It was the same flag that had draped her first husband's coffin when his body came home from Vietnam 50 years earlier. "Thank you, Michael," she whispered to the headstone. "Thank you for remembering that Stanley mattered." The flag fluttered in the November wind, a symbol of all the promises kept and prices paid, all the choices between comfort and conscience that define a life worth living. In the distance, the city of Chicago rose against the gray sky, full of people making their own choices, their own small stands for what they believed was right. And in a house on Ashland Avenue that had been home to 3 generations of O'Connors, Michael's grandson sat at the same kitchen table where his grandfather had once made the hardest decision of his life, reading aloud from a history book to his own young children. The story he read was about ordinary heroes, about people who chose to do the right thing even when it cost them everything, about the price of integrity in a complicated world. The children listened with wide eyes, not yet understanding that they were learning the most important lesson their great-grandfather could have taught them. Some things, the story said, are worth more than money. Some choices define not just who we are, but who we choose to become. Some weights are necessary to keep our souls light. The coffee percolated in the kitchen, the November wind rattled the windows, and another generation of O'Connors learned that the simplest choices are often the most profound. Michael Patrick O'Connor had been buried that morning, but his legacy lived on in every child who learned to choose courage over comfort, in every person who stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, in every family that measured wealth, not by what they owned, but by what they believed. The weight of simple days, he had learned, was the weight of all the choices that mattered. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got to choose love.